Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the Indicator limited edition release of the 1940 classic Remember the Night, which of course was directed by Mitchell Leisen and written by Preston Sturges just before he would turn to directing himself and embark on the legendary series of films that made him one of the most iconic and beloved names in terms of 1940s Hollywood. But interestingly, just like Billy Wilder, it was seemingly because his scripts had been directed by Mitchell Leisen in slightly different ways, or had changes applied that really spurred him on to becoming a director himself. So it's really due in some parts to Mitchell Leisen's work on films like this that actually spurred both Billy Wilder and Preston Sturges to become two of the greatest directors of all time. But Leisen does have a lot of really interesting elements he brings to these films, and Remember the Night in particular, I think, benefits from him being in the director's chair, because I think the actual romance and the actual emotional qualities of the story are much more fleshed out than I think they probably were originally, or at least there was a greater focus spent on the human condition in the story, as opposed to being the all-out 100% intensity Preston Sturges, just incredible sense of comedy and the incredible characters and the quirkiness of the characters he would create. And so while there's plenty of Sturges elements in this film, I think it's sort of worked into what Leisen was doing. And so I think Remember the Night is actually quite balanced, but I think there are times where you feel that sort of schism between Leisen and Sturges' approach. And so when Sturges basically erupts in his own filmography that he's directing with films like The Great McGinty, all of a sudden we have full Preston Sturges, whereas before it had been Sturges as a screenwriter sort of filtered through various directors, whether it be Leisen or William Wyler or others. And I think some of the films definitely have a degree of other voices coming in, and I think, again, like Billy Wilder, who was most famously rather, shall we say, not pleased with how Hold Back the Dawn turned out, which Leisen directed and Wilder co-wrote with Charles Brackett. Well, Wilder was not pleased at how that film was tweaked and changed from his original concepts with Brackett, and there was a lot of even autobiographical materials of Wilder trying to even get his citizenship and get into the country as a struggling writer and things. So there was a lot of him in there, and that kind of got toned down in ways. So Wilder was famously always not pleased with how that film turned out, and that spurred him into trying to just direct his own material. So I think there's always some degree of that in this film, and all the Sturges films where he was a developing screenwriter. But here I think it's an interesting fusion between the two styles, and I think part of this is why the film is a beloved classic for those people who actually know it. It is one of the great holiday films, but unfortunately it's not been really trumpeted as one of the great holiday films unless you're a classic film geek or you watch TCM a lot and when they're running Universal films. But also I think part of that's due to the fact that the film just has not had a good video history, and Universal has not really supported the film as a holiday classic, which if they had, I think it would be much better known and it would be in the usual sort of rotation. Because before the Indicator Blu-ray release, all we had was this Universal HD Master as a Blu-ray that was only sold through, I believe, TCM outlets. It was one of those limited availability discs, and there had been a limited availability special order Universal DVD, which I think all of these are the same master, actually, most likely. And before that, there was nothing but a mid-90s VHS release. That's it. So the film never had a mass release on home video. It never had a wide release DVD, never had a wide release Blu-ray, never even had a Laserdisc, just had that one VHS tape, I believe, in 1996 or so. So I think that's part of the reason why the film is not as well known. But quite frankly, it should be, because it's an absolute gem. And in addition to the sort of unique blending of Mitchell Leisen's style with Preston Sturges' emerging just sprawling creativity, you've got just an incredible lead pairing between Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck 4 years before Double Indemnity. So it makes it even more fascinating viewing, because the whole time all you can think of is Double Indemnity and how they're so fantastic on screen together, and their chemistry is just palpable. But here you get to see them, not trying to carry off a murder plot and then perhaps murder each other. But there's fascinating little flashes of darker, grittier moments that, almost indicate things you'll see in Double Indemnity, because it's only 4 years that separate them. So in my mind, I think Billy Wilder must have seen this picture. And of course, he was at Paramount, so he obviously probably would have. But I think this might have been in the back of his mind when he was trying to cast Double Indemnity, and these names started coming up, and I think he might have flashed back to some of the just slight tinges of darkness in certain moments in this film, Remember the Night. So it's fascinating for fans of Billy Wilder and Double Indemnity and Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck, because you get that sort of interesting parallel. And they're so good together that it's a shame that they only made a handful of films. But then again, Fred MacMurray is one of those incredible actors who seems to have been phenomenal for any actress he was paired with. Because if you just go and look at his filmography, every great star that he appeared with, it's usually some of their best performances when they're paired with him. It's some sort of dynamic, almost a sort of easygoing charm, I guess, or something like that, that allows for such great byplay between MacMurray and whatever actress he's paired with. And that's first and foremost in Remember the Night, which is all about that developing, budding romance. And it's got one of the all-time greatest, most sensationally developed, just out there, unexpected meet cutes in any film you'll ever see. The meet cute of this film is the setup of the plot, where we open with the shoplifter, played by Barbara Stanwyck, who decides to abscond with a nice piece of diamond jewelry and gets caught. And it's the district attorney who's assigned to prosecute her. That is the Fred MacMurray character. And all this is taking place just before Christmas, and after a really funny opening courtroom scene where Stanwyck's lawyer is exceedingly long-winded. MacMurray's DA gets the case postponed until after the Christmas break so they can all come back later and just go and enjoy their holidays. This, of course, means that our Lady of the Peace will be stuck in jail for Christmas, and then our DA starts to feel a little bit guilty about it and gets her bailed out. But, of course, this being a Preston Sturges script, the bail bondsman has a very dirty mind and deposits Stanwyck's character back at MacMurray's character's apartment, almost as if there's now supposed to be some transaction that's carried out. And, of course, our DA is completely humiliated and has not intended any of this. He was just trying to be nice. But now she's out of a nice warm room and a Christmas dinner in jail. And so now what is she going to do? And it's a nice sort of dynamic that's established here. And this is where the film starts to really build up, where we know it's going to develop into a romance. But it's the how it gets there that becomes most fascinating, because they start to find commonalities with each other and find they're not only from the same state, but grew up in towns very much nearby. And our DA is going back home, as he does every Christmas, to spend the holidays with his doting mother. So at this point, the film basically turns into a road movie of sorts for this section. And this is probably the most sort of, I guess, Preston Sturges flavor you get consistently, where it's just one fantastic bit of comedy dialogue or a comedy set piece, or they get lost, or there's a bad road detour and things. And of course, the famous image is them winding up spending the night in a car in the middle of a field of cows and waking up the next morning. So we see the various quirky characters that we would expect from a Sturges film, but then suddenly the film can turn on a dime and go right into emotional melodrama, really, because when we go back to the Stanwyck character's hometown, we see that she did not have a very good childhood, and it's to the credit of these characters that they always remain human and feel honest and behave in ways that are completely believable. So she winds up being taken home by our sort of knight in shining armor district attorney to his family home, where it's this wonderful sort of idyllic farmhouse run by his mother, played by Beulah Bondi. And we see the Stanwyck character essentially get to spend probably the only happy holiday she's ever had in her life, and she doesn't even know how to process this, that that people are actually nice to her and behave like normal people. Of course, the gag is that through all this idyllic stuff going on, and we see these two growing closer and closer, and we know that obviously the romance has developed much further. The gag is that they both know, and everybody knows, that once it hits January, they've got to drive back because he's got a prosecutor, and she's going to go to jail most likely because she is guilty. So it's an interesting sort of undercurrent that runs throughout all of this material. So the more emotional and heartfelt that it is, the more that undercurrent really stings when you stop and think about it, and then when the characters stop and think about it, and all that sort of happiness has that constant tinge, that dread running under everything. So it gives it a sort of tragic flavor as well. But that's the interesting plot hook of this film that Sturges came up with. The phenomenal meet cute of the romantic leads meeting in a courtroom where one's the prosecutor and one's the criminal. And the sort of way their relationship works is that the upstanding prosecutor, district attorney, starts to see the other side of criminality, and the criminal starts to see the other side of being the upstanding citizen. So it's perhaps one of the great examples of opposites attract. But what makes it all work is that everything is done in a believable, honest, and human manner. So while we have the incredible comedy sense of Sturges, I think it's sort of tempered by Mitchell Leisen directing, because this is one of those holiday films that does make people emotional by the end. It is one of the films that does have that sort of, it can make you laugh, it can make you pull out the hanky every once in a while. So it's an interesting sort of blend of the two. My only qualm with it is I don't think it's necessarily as refined of a shift as it could be between those two. And I think you can get the sense of why Sturges was getting frustrated by this point of seeing his scripts get not necessarily manipulated, but massaged into slightly different forms, and so it strays from the original concept. I would love to be able to read Sturges' original script someday, just to be able to see all of the specific differences. But there were a number of cuts made to his script, and again, I think Leisen really tried to focus on the drama of the character moments more than the sort of whimsy that Sturges probably had more of in his original concept. So again, I think you can get this sense here in 1940. This is where Sturges is really sort of chafing at the bit and starting to do what Billy Wilder had done and try to just go and direct his own script material because he didn't like the way that people were handling it. But again, I do think that Leisen did bring something important to this film, because you do need that emotional quality. You need that sense of the human condition, and that grounds the story and makes you really care about the characters even more than if it were just, say, a plain, straight-out screwball comedy. But it has plenty of screwball elements, so this is an interesting sort of blend essentially between screwball and melodrama, but it's also a holiday film. So it's a fascinating film. It is a definite classic. It's one of the films that should be better known as one of the great holiday films. It's a film you can return to every year because it's so incredibly genuine in terms of the emotion that's on display and the depths of the lead characters and the melodrama blending with comedy so nicely that you get the pluses of both. I just think myself, it might have been a little bit more cohesive in terms of mixing that tone if it had just been, Sturges doing the whole film himself and sticking to the way he had originally conceived it, as opposed to having some of that natural back and forth of somebody else tweaking and changing things. But again, I do think Leisen brought important material to this film, and if it had been just Sturges by himself, I don't know if the character moments and the real dramatic moments would have had the same sort of dramatic weight to them. They would have had plenty of dramatic weight, but maybe not as much as what Leisen crafted with his direction. So it's an interesting film to study in terms of the tonality and the creative aspects as well. And you do have to look at this film as being that sort of point at which Preston Sturges was deciding to stop just being a screenwriter and going on to just write and direct his own material. I think this is probably felt most in the ending of the film, which is a good ending, don't get me wrong, but the first time I saw this film, and I've sort of heard it echoed by others, the first time I saw the film, it was a little bit jarring, I have to say, because I didn't exactly know where the story was going for that ending, as with most screwball comedies or films with screwball elements of this period. That first viewing, you don't necessarily know how everything's going to turn out. But it sort of was teetering back and forth between elements of comedy and drama, and then suddenly we have the ending of the film, and it takes a second to adjust, essentially, because you have to think in your brain, oh, wait, oh, this is where we're going? Oh, well, I get that now, but it just felt a little sudden that first viewing, and I think that's probably the point at which I could point to as the greatest example of this sort of back and forth between Sturges and Leisen in terms of the tone of the overall film, because it just feels a little bit jarring, just a bit, that first viewing. But the more times you see the film, I think it feels a bit more cohesive, and you know where it's going. But that first viewing, it might throw viewers a little bit. I know it did me when I first saw the film years ago, and this was long before I knew about the actual production and things. But once I started reading about this, was the point at which where Sturges was starting to go and direct his own material and was frustrated like Billy Wilder had been. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes that ending make sense, because that it's a little bit jarring in the tonal shift there, but it's still a great ending. Again, don't get me wrong, but that would be the moment I would highlight as probably the best example of the sort of tone shifting back and forth between the two sort of styles that's inherent in this film. Of course, the film was made in 1940, so there are, like any film from this period, there's going to usually be some sort of dated elements or references and things. Here, there is a character who is unfortunately just written as a basic African-American comedic stereotype. The MacMurray character has a butler of sorts who's like a live-in butler in his apartment, although I kind of wondered why a DA would need a butler in an apartment scenario. But he is played by Fred Toombs, who went under the stage name of Snowflake. And he's not in the film very long, but it is obviously a dated, stereotyped character. And also, you do have to keep in mind that these actors and actresses who had to play these parts, this was unfortunately, usually the only type of work they could get in a major Hollywood film, and they were also bringing their own talents of playing in vaudeville and on stage and things. So it sort of, unfortunately, is a product of the time. It is off-putting, usually, to viewers who see this film for the first time, which is understandable, but it is something that is just, unfortunately, a byproduct of the time. But I like to mention that whenever there's something like this that pops up that's not a major character, but when people see the film the first time, especially now, they're not quite expecting that, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh. And of course, this is similar, I would say, to other times that he would pop up in films. Honestly, it's quite similar to the character he plays in the masterpiece serial Daredevils of the Red Circle, which I reviewed, and also mentioned that because that's something that, again, if you're not expecting it, to have the sort of bumbling house servant or butler stereotype, it is what it is. It's unfortunately a product of his time, and that does pop up in here in the film, just briefly towards the opening in one or two short scenes. But I just wanted to mention that because that's usually something that everybody comments on when they see the film for the first time. So that's here. Thankfully, it's very minor, but it is just a product of its time, unfortunately. Ultimately, though, Remember the Night is an absolute classic. It is a holiday film to return to every year. It features remarkable melodrama and great comedy, with a great sense of warmth to it that is most reflected in the incredible lead performances of Barbara Stanwyck and Fred MacMurray, and the incredible chemistry they have on screen together, which for all of us plays right into Double Indemnity. So if you've never seen this film before, seeing it for the first time and knowing it's just 4 years before Double Indemnity, it makes their chemistry on screen in a positive light much more fascinating than it would be, because all you can do is think of the more famous film and how it's the complete polar opposite of this. To now talk about the picture quality of this release, this is an older Universal master. I'm thinking it's probably the exact same thing we saw on their limited release Blu-ray here in the US and the limited release DVD just before that. So it was probably made for that DVD first, but of course, being made later, it was an HD master to begin with. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a modern 2K or 4K restoration for this title, which I think it really deserves it, especially since the photography by Ted Tetzlaff, one of the great cameramen, is absolutely gorgeous throughout. So even though this is an older master, the photography still really benefits from being in HD, but we could probably do even better if Universal would do a 2K or especially a 4K master, which this really deserves. Nicely, this does have the original Paramount logos after a more modern Universal one that starts the film, and it being an older master, obviously it's going to have some baked in damage and things. This is not a restoration, this is merely an older HD master, so do expect some obviously some wear in the form of the occasional speck or scratch or slight line poking in, things like that. A little bit of frame movement here and there, but mostly just a little bit of specks and scratches here and there. Nothing terribly major, but something that I think we would expect from an older HD master. Now, the disc is encoded very well, as indicator discs always are, but it's an older Universal master to begin with, so I think you'll notice one or two spots where it's kind of showing its age a little bit, like in the opening titles. The grain is a little bit stagnant around like some of the actual letters, and this stuff is much more visible when it's obviously in its HD form instead of the original DVD, and now that we're looking at Blu-rays of older HD masters upscaled to 4K, issues in older source masters like this are much more visible and obvious. So I think watching this, you can tell it's obviously an older master, but it still holds up well. But again, it would benefit very greatly from a new 4K scan and restoration and UHD presentation if Universal will ever get around to it. So overall, I think this is probably the best presentation of this Universal HD master, especially with it being handled by Indicator, but do keep in mind it's an older Universal HD master, and they've never shown this film much love on home video, and before the DVD and Blu-rays and this master, all we had was a 1996 VHS tape. So at least we have an HD master and lovely Indicator Blu-ray, because before this point, we didn't really have much for this film, unfortunately. In terms of the audio quality, it's the original mono mix here in lossless quality. It does have some natural hiss present, which is good. It doesn't seem like it's been over-scrubbed to death in terms of noise reduction, which unfortunately it can be common to more modern releases of Universal catalog titles, even some of their UHDs. So I think the audio fares well, but again, like the picture, it could use a full, complete restoration job, but of course, with the way people handle audio these days, they might overdo that restoration work. So I'd rather have it, as is to a degree. There is a little bit of noise in the track every once in a while, but all of it seems intrinsic to the source they were transferring, and nothing seems very much out of place. But I don't have the previous DVDs and Blu-rays to compare with, nor the 90s VHS tape, but I'm thinking they're probably all coming from the same source, as is common to most Universal Classic releases. They're usually just using the same source over and over again, but this sounds, I think, probably as good as it could, unless, again, the film got the full 4K treatment and also somebody didn't over-scrub the audio like Universal likes to do. So I think it sounds good, and I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't have more source defects and things, and so I think it's probably about the best the film has probably sounded. But again, the previous DVD and Blu-ray, I think, stem from the same master anyway, so it's pretty much the same as those. In terms of the packaging and artwork, this is the Indicator Limited Edition with one of their beautiful hard case boxes. Of course, we have the little J card with the blurb about the film. and the fact that this was limited to just 3,000 copies. So unfortunately, this is now sold out, but you can get the same great disc in their standard edition. But this is just one of their beautiful limited packages, and any indicator title that has a limited version, I do strongly suggest you purchase that sooner rather than later, because once they go out of print, you lose the amazing box and great book and all of the wonderful printed materials. But the disc contents are exactly the same. So the standard version has the same disc with the same high quality presentation of this Universal Master with the wonderful indicator extras. So here is the limited edition hard case box itself. Beautiful printing of the original poster artwork, lovely spine in the indicator style, and then the rear with the great tagline and the great list of supplements. The limited edition comes with another of Indicator's essential books. This is a beautiful, almost 80-page book on the film, done in Indicator's lovely style. So it's loaded with fantastic images, and then a mixture of new articles and essay pieces, and then fascinating vintage materials in terms of original press book pieces, news pieces of the time. But Indicator always goes into detail about the production and the crew along with the cast. So there's a lot of discussion about Sturges and Mitchell Leisen, of course MacMurray and Stanwyck, but where the film comes in Sturges' career. Here's, of course, the iconic scene where they have a third passenger in the car with them. But the Indicator books are always the best in the business, and it's really fascinating when they do a special edition like this and a full book just for a single film. And so while it's maybe just a tiny bit slimmer at 80 pages instead of, say, 120 for one of their box sets, it's still fantastic that one film gets an entire book devoted to it. And of course, on the back, they always include a photo of the director. So here is our lead pair with Mitchell Leisen himself. Then we have a beautiful fold-out reproduction of the original poster, beautifully printed with really nice color, but it's reversible with one of the alternative original posters, which also is very nicely printed. So I love it when posters get included, but I love it even more when it's an Indicator box, because they always take the time to get the printing right, and also they print it on a little bit thicker paper stock, so it's got a more premium quality feel to it. But I just absolutely love this poster and image, so this is very, very frameable. And then we have the case itself, which of course has the original artwork and the list of extras on the back. On the inside, we have the disc label, nicely printed with the same artwork, but the limited edition also has reversible artwork with another original poster, and this one to me very much has that sort of Lady Eve look to it in terms of the way Stanwyck is looking at MacMurray there. So this is another nice touch of the limited editions. So if you get the standard version, because this version is now unfortunately out of print, you're basically just going to get the case with the main artwork and the same exact disc, but you lose out on the reversible art, the book, the poster, and the wonderful hard case box as well. So again, the Indicator limited sets are really worth your time and money when they do come around, because once they're gone, you usually regret very strongly that you didn't get the limited version. So to go over the supplements in this release, of course, we have the Universal Master with original mono audio. This release has a brand new audio commentary with Adrian Martin. This is a very good track. He makes a strong case for Mitchell Leisen being respected more as a great director and his contributions to this film. I can't say that I 100% agree with all of that, but I think it's very important to understanding this film, and I do think that Leisen is underrated and undervalued. I can certainly agree with that. And he goes into great background about the film's production and how it did eventually differ from Sturges' script and where Sturges was at this point in his career, in addition to some discussion of MacMurray and Stanwyck in the film. But the main focus seems to be on looking at Leisen's contribution and his direction. Then for more of that, we have a 26-minute piece with Jeff Andrew talking about Remember the Night, and specifically the contributions of Leisen and Preston Sturges, and how the two had different approaches and how those different approaches sort of fuse together in the final film and make it something rather unique. So it's great to have more of that and a nice nearly 30-minute discussion piece. We get another 26-minute discussion piece, but this is Pamela Hutchinson talking about basically the rise and main career of Barbara Stanwyck, and it's great for people who have not dug into Stanwyck's history and how she even got into acting, and especially film acting, to have this context. This is a really well done piece, basically doing Stanwyck's career biography, but in much greater detail, especially about her early years in terms of her early days in film, especially, and then how she sort of became the iconic Barbara Stanwyck we all think of. And once you have some of this knowledge for background and context, it makes her performances that were already sensational and outstanding even more impressive. So it's really fantastic that Indicator has this piece on here that gives greater context to Stanwyck's career. And again, at nearly 30 minutes, it's a nice lengthier conversation piece. It's not just a little, 5 to 10 minute video essay or fluff piece. We then have 2 hour-long radio adaptations from 1940 and 1942 from the Lux Radio Theater. These are presented in lossy Dolby Digital and sound very good, but of course they are vintage radio recordings that survive, so the quality is limited. But the first one is starring Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck reprising their roles, and it's fascinating to see the film distilled down to an hour with, honestly, in these radio versions, there's a little bit more energy to the dialogue and delivery because it's a radio version and you've only got an hour, and so it's already abridged a bit. But I think there's a little degree of maybe a slight extra bit of energy that might have been there, say, if Preston Sturges had actually directed his own script instead of Mitchell Leisen. But again, it shows what, I think it underlines what Leisen brought to the film because of that more energy and that quicker pace, and because it's an abridged version of the film, it doesn't always resonate as much as some of the more dramatic moments in the film. So that's a great inclusion, but the more fascinating one is the 1942 second version, which basically uses the same script or a very similar script, and Fred MacMurray reprises his role again, but this time without Barbara Stanwyck. This time it's Jean Arthur, and she has a completely different energy for the character. She's fantastic, but because it's Jean Arthur, you have a harder time buying that she's a criminal. And it's a fascinating alternative reading on the character. I mean, it's basically the same character and the same dialogue, but it's a whole different energy. It's of course a different actress with a different persona, but I always find it fascinating looking at vintage radio adaptations of films, especially famous films, or where the actor or actress is so iconic in the role, and then seeing somebody else who is also a famous iconic star basically do their version. And in cases like this, it can be so completely different while still being the same character and dialogue that it's like an alternate universe version of that character. So of the two, this is the much more fascinating one because it has that completely different aspect to it of having somebody else play Stanwyck's role and do a sensational job of it, but it's also Jean Arthur. So again, it's kind of hard at the start, having to you have to keep reminding yourself that she's playing the Stanwyck role, and so she is a criminal and a thief and a shoplifter and things. So you have to distance yourself mentally from the traditional image we have of Jean Arthur, who I think is one of the most adorable of all classic Hollywood actresses. But I just find it fascinating that it's Jean Arthur playing the Stanwyck role, and she's really great. So it's the more fascinating of the two, but they're both good to listen to and really great adaptations, even though they do have to dispense with a lot of the really great scenes because you've only got an hour to play with. And interestingly, I'll point out that when the butler character has a brief appearance in this abridged version, he's played a little bit less of a, well, I mean, it's still an unfortunate stereotype, but in terms of the performance in the radio versions, I think because it's moving faster and it has a bit more energy because it's just an hour on radio, and you've also got different actors, it's not quite as the character doesn't come across quite as so bumbling, and so I think the radio versions actually are a little bit easier to swallow, I guess is the way to put it, in terms of, I just thought it was interesting that it seems like that was tweaked a little bit in terms of how that was handled. So it's actually, I think, an improvement in terms of at least making the stereotyped character come across a little bit more normal and less stereotyped. So it's only a minor amount, unfortunately, but I did notice that, and I was like, oh well, at least that comes across a little bit better here. And then fascinatingly, we have the 1942 Hollywood Caravan film, which of course was featuring all kinds of stars at the time trying to raise money by getting people to buy war bonds. But it's a fascinating World War II document of, again, getting all these famous faces on the screen, but also it was shot on the back lot in certain parts. So you have this character we follow, this girl who's trying to get into the studio so she could beg to get on the train of the caravan of Hollywood stars going to do a war bond drive. So we see her being chased by the studio police and running into all these famous faces, including Barbara Stanwyck, as they're watching a scene get shot. So you get that sort of at least time capsule, sort of behind the scenes glimpse here and there, even though it's still a promotional piece. But it's a fascinating inclusion. It's fascinating to see all these famous faces pop up out of character parts or off camera, but of course they're still just on camera playing their personas. But it's a great, just wonderfully charming little piece of the essentially World War II propaganda effort, but it's been nicely transferred here. It's an HD transfer of obviously a worn print source, but in spite of having a frame jump or a little bit of scratches here and there, it's actually well shot, and it's a fascinating inclusion, and it's fun to watch because you see so many famous faces pop up, from Alan Ladd to Bing Crosby. But of course, for me, probably the standout is at the end when they're doing the sort of war bond drive on stage. Humphrey Bogart comes out and has a whole little speech. So as a giant Bogart fan, it's great to have more Bogart material, even if it's in obviously a war bond drive piece. But it's really well done, and I'm really happy that Indicator included this here. And as usual, if they do something like this, they do their darndest to make it look as good as they can. So this is an HD presentation of this, which is something you don't often see, of a vintage piece of World War II propaganda material, a 20-minute short subject getting an actual HD transfer and made to look as good as they can. So that's a great inclusion. We get the original trailer for the film, which has some custom material because there's a custom voiceover and things. So it's a nice trailer. Unfortunately, it's just still a standard def file. It's probably what Universal provided Indicator with, but Indicator did encode it well, so it upscales nicely, and I think it looks as good as it could. Trailers, unfortunately, often don't get a lot of love and attention. It's rare when they actually get an HD scan, and even if it's an old standard def file, usually most people just slap it on a disc and they look really crummy, and then especially if you're upscaling it to a 4K television, they look downright terrible. But Indicator always does take the time to encode these well, so you don't run into all kinds of nasty upscaling problems or aliasing and things. So that is something that I do really appreciate, that even if all they have is an old standard def trailer file, they take their time to try and make that look as good as it can on a disc release. So it's nice to see that, and great that we do have the trailer in some form. There's also another lovely Indicator image gallery, which is quite extensive and full of wonderful higher res photos, production stills, posters, foreign posters, lobby cards. An Indicator always outdoes themselves in putting together a nice image gallery. But here there's an interesting one because there is a still where you see Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck in character in a scene where they're bobbing for apples, which is mentioned as part of the holiday festivities, but is not included in the film. So I think this might be a scene that was shot and actually removed from the film, and part of the bits and pieces that was in Sturges' original screenplay that was removed or changed. So I think it's fascinating seeing a glimpse of that here. And then, as always, Indicator has new and improved English subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing. They do usually make all of their own subtitles or tweak the subtitle files to actually be proper and correct, and that's something that I think they deserve more attention for, because very few, if anybody, does that, and they do that on practically every release that they do. So I always find that very, very impressive and something I wish more people would do. And then, of course, this is the limited edition and the film's UK premiere on Blu-ray, because again, we got it here in the US as a limited release Blu-ray. So the indicator release of Remember the Night in the limited edition, or if you just get the standard edition, because unfortunately the limited version is now sold out, this is definitely the best overall presentation of the film we've yet seen. It is, I think, the best rendering of this Universal HD Master and has extensive supplements that are not to be found on the US releases. So this is definitely the version you need to have in your collection. This is an absolute classic. It's an underrated classic, and it's one of the holiday films because it is set at Christmas and New Year's and the turn of the year. It's one of those that just unfortunately kind of flies under the radar, but once you see it, it becomes so ingrained in your mind that it quickly becomes one of the cherished favorite films you want to watch every holiday season. And quite frankly, you should, because it's among the greatest holiday films. It should be run every year. And I think it's because Universal hasn't really done a lot of video releases and really supported the film and sort of proclaimed it as a holiday film that it just hasn't gotten that recognition yet. But if they were to do that, or more people become aware of it on, say, the lovely Indicator release, then, you know, if we can get the word out, then maybe it'll be more respected as one of the great holiday films. But it's also fascinating seeing Barbara Stanwyck and Fred MacMurray have a wonderful on-screen relationship that, of course, is the polar opposite of their more famous one in Double Indemnity. So you get that nice humorous aspect that was unintended when you see the film now. And it's a fascinating fusion of the styles of Preston Sturges and Mitchell Leisen, even though they're sort of diametrically opposed to each other in ways, and also the point at which you see Preston Sturges really break away and decide he wants to direct his own material, and this is where we start the immortal run of Preston Sturges masterpieces in the 1940s. So this film is truly important for being at that sort of crossroads in Sturges' career, and that alone would get it in the film history books. But it's also a great film in its own right, and it only grows over repeat viewing. And it's one of those films you can return to time and time again, as you really should around the holiday season. And it manages to always have that sense of the human condition, because we get the incredible Preston Sturges comedy and quirky characters and incredible setups and situations and the phenomenal meet cute that starts off the film, balanced with Mitchell Leisen's handling of the dramatic scenes. And so you get a nice sort of fusion of those two styles, which does make the film feel a bit more three-dimensional than other films that have tried to do that and not really pulled it off anywhere near as well. So again, the Indicator release is the best release of the film to date. If Universal ever does a 4K scan and restoration of the film, we could see a beautiful UHD that would upgrade over their old master. But until that happens, the best you can do is the lovely Indicator Blu-ray release. This is one of their must-own releases. It is far better in terms of encoding and the overall supplements than the pretty much bare bones US copies, which are also kind of pricey and were limited availability to begin with. So I think this is definitely one of the Indicator titles that any classic film fan should import and have a region-free player for. And Indicator has put together a really nice supplemental features package that will only enhance your love and appreciation for this film, which is a true classic and should be regarded as such. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films, holiday films, physical media releases, and my love of the Indicator label has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you're a fan of the film like me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and especially if you've been able to check out the Indicator release and some of its incredible supplements. I hate that the limited editions sell out so quickly, because the box sets and the books and the efforts put into them are so fantastic that I wish more people could see and experience them and have them in their collections. But thankfully, the standard edition is the exact same wonderful disc. You still get all the same great supplements. You just unfortunately lose out on all the beautiful box and incredible book and poster and everything. But in any case, definitely get a copy of the Indicator release in whichever version you can. It is an absolute must. And again, a title you definitely should have a region-free player for. So as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Well, I've really got to go now. I've been talking too long. I've got one heck of a drive back home.